E karuma, e kuima, e raurangatirama, e ngohamahi o te whare wānanga o Waikato, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Neil Quigley. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University. It's my pleasure to welcome you here for this inaugural professorial lecture. The inaugural professorial lectures are an opportunity for our newly appointed or promoted professors to tell the university community and members of the public about the research that they undertake. As I'm sure you're all aware, since you're here, this evening's professorial lecture will be given by Carolyn King, also known as Kim King, her lifelong nickname. Kim was born in England and studied at Liverpool and Oxford universities. Her first PhD from Cross College, Oxford, was the first ever full-length study of the field of ecology of British weasels. It was completed in 1971 and immediately led to an invitation to move to New Zealand to join DSIR Ecology Division as a specialist on introduced carnivores and especially stoats. Between 1977 and 1994, when family concerns took priority, Kim worked part-time from home, writing papers and books and editing scientific journals for the Royal Society of New Zealand. She came to the University of Waikato as a visiting scholar in 1991 and joined the staff in 1995, teaching zoology in the Faculty of Science and Engineering. Her research interests have concentrated on the ecology of invasive rodents and mustelids, especially stoats and ferrets, rats and mice. Much of the information needed for the field study of these animals in the New Zealand context was not available to start with, so Kim began by developing new techniques for monitoring and sampling small predators in the wild. These techniques have been widely used and improved by others, allowing a greater understanding of small predator populations that is still the basis of much pest control work today. Kim's first book, Immigrant Killers, published in 1984, was the first review of the ecology of introduced predators in New Zealand. It made some controversial statements which stimulated a lot of later research. Her two best-known books, The Natural History of Weasels and Stoats and The Handbook of New Zealand Mammals, both went into second editions with Oxford University Press in 2005 and 2007, respectively. In 1989, Kim began to explore another area of her interests, that is the relationship between traditional and contemporary explanations of how the world works. That led to her completing a second PhD in religious studies from our department here at Waikato, and to further explorations on the interface between evolutionary biology and contemporary theology, which resulted in a book published in 2002, Habitat and Grace. Kim received the annual award from the New Zealand Ecological Society in 1999, the Silver Medal of the Mammal Society in 2005, and the Kudos Lifetime Achievement Award in 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Kim King to give her inaugural professorial lecture.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for your kind words, and Dean, for your presence here. And thank you all for coming, because you've given me the opportunity to review and celebrate my lifelong fascination with these beautiful and widely misunderstood animals. And it is rather a timely time to be doing this, because, as you realise, a few months ago, the government made a massive announcement of $28 million, which is to be put forward to achieving the very aspirational game of predator-free New Zealand by 2050. It's not that they're going to pay for the actual work themselves. The idea, and it's just as well, because other estimates reckon the actual cost will be in the billions, not millions. But the idea is to establish a joint venture company run by people who have the vision and the passion and the conviction that it is possible to find the technological innovations and the social change required to achieve this goal. Of course, when it was advertised overseas or reported overseas, there were a lot of skepticism. I had a letter from a friend of mine in Adelaide who asked me if it was a hoax. It isn't a hoax, but it is not going to be easy, and it's really important to look at it in context. And one of the contexts that needed to be recognised, which is often not recognised, is the fact that this is not the first time that New Zealand has faced the crippling losses caused by an invasive pest. At the end of the 19th century, the damage done by rabbits to pastoral leaseholding in the southern South Island was so severe that many run holders had to simply walk away from their land. Their sheep were dying, their lamb percentages were reduced enormously, the wool clip was reduced. They were absolutely desperate, and some of them really had no option except to leave. And that meant that the runs were up again for re-letting at a different rental, and very often the land inspector had to go with the owner and view the devastation caused by rabbits. This cartoon is captioned, "This country is so poor, even the rabbits bring a cut lunch." The run holders were so desperate to retrieve their fortunes, they looked around everywhere to find more and better ways of killing rabbits. And what better could be than the natural predators, which could perhaps be the reason why rabbits got so abundant, because these natural predators were not here. So they sent to England and they imported thousands of stoats and weasels. That figure there is the number that I've been able to trace in records, in import records and shipping reports of stoats and weasels that were brought in over a short period of 10 years. And also because ferrets are domesticated and easily obtained and easily bred in captivity, over about 20 or 30 years, something upwards of 75,000 of these were bred in studs around the South Island for release on the worst of the pastures damage. So with that number of predators attacking the rabbits, you would think that they ought to have made a huge amount of difference. Well, they did kill a lot of rabbits, but the problem is it's not just the number killed, it's the number that are left over, and the number that were missed, and how quickly they breed, and how many animals come in from outside. So the problem with rabbits is that they can breed much faster than predators can remove them. Here's a little diagram that goes back to John Flux, who was one of my colleagues in DSR Ecology Division in the early days, an expert in rabbits and hare ecology. And he pointed out that if you had an area of a square kilometre, you might have of the order of about 2,000 rabbits in the worst areas, but you could probably only have about 5 cats and maybe 5 each of the other predators, and they couldn't possibly even remove the annual increase of 20,000 young a year. So there was never any possibility that they could keep the rabbits down. So what happened was that in the South Island, you can have a range of rabbit density, and this is the proportion of those killed by the native predators. And what happened if you added the mustelids? It increased the predation rate, but not high enough to knock down the recruitment rate. So it was a last-ditch attempt to control the rabbits, but it didn't work. The same story on a smaller scale can be retold in Takahi Valley. This is a valley just west of Te Anau, in the mountains there, where the takahi, which was a native bird that was thought to have been extinct for 50 years, was rediscovered in 1948. And the Wildlife Service of the time thought that all they needed to do was to close the area to human interference and set traps for stoats. And they did that, And by the time I arrived in New Zealand in 1972, they were wondering how they could improve what they were doing, because although they were catching stoats, the numbers of takahi still were going down. So they took me up to the Takahi Valley at the beginning of winter, a real experience for one fresh out of England, and they asked me, what can we do to make this situation better? And my answer was, we need to understand how stoat populations work. It's fairly clear that you can't control a population artificially unless you know what controls it naturally. So that question was the first one that I had to embark upon. And I didn't know the answer at the time, but I did have the advantage of an English country childhood where everything alive was of fascinating interest. I had as my main companions as a child horses and dogs, and they are wonderful tutors about animal life. I went to a very good grammar school where I had an inspiring zoology teacher who gave me a solid grounding in classical zoology, and again later on in Liverpool, and then finally to Oxford, where I had the enormous privilege of working on weasels in the famous Wytham Wood. Almost the only thing they remember me for my time there was that I was the first and only student in the history of the University of Oxford who managed to persuade the Department of Zoology to buy a pony as a research vehicle. It was obviously, to me, the simplest thing. A pony is much cheaper to buy, much cheaper to run, makes much less noise and fuss underfoot. To me, it was obvious. I don't know why not more people do the same. However, I had in those years a good introduction to how weasel populations work. And I also had a lot of help from gamekeepers. Now, although weasels and stoats are native predators in Britain, native carnivores valued for that, they are on game estates regarded as pests because they kill the flightless game chicks when they're very young. So there's been a long history of gamekeepers developing systems of systematic trapping to remove stoats and weasels from the game estates, from the breeding areas, particularly in the spring breeding season. And I learned from them how to operate these systematic tunnel trapping, and particularly how they used the Fen Trap. The Fen Trap is the humane alternative to the gin trap, the leg hold trap, which was banned in England in 1958. And it's designed to be worked in a tunnel so that the jaws of the trap close over the back and the spine of the animal instead of holding it by the foot. And this is not only very much more humane than a leg hold trap, but also it guarantees much better chances of getting animals that are good for studying, because the animals don't have the chance to break their teeth on the trap or chew off their own foot or evacuate their guts. So that meant that they were much better as samples for study. So I started off by introducing the Fen Trap into New Zealand, because I was a bit amazed to find that the gin trap was then, and I think still is, legal in New Zealand. So I made sure that the Fen Trap was used in all the areas where the rangers of the national parks were collecting stoats for me. And then I started working out ways of monitoring and sampling stoats in areas where it was too large or too remote to use traps. And that's where the next challenge was, to work out how to figure out where they were and roughly how many there were without actually catching them. And the answer to that was to use a tunnel, which has in the tunnel a central ink pad and papers on either side, which were able to pick up prints that would be made by the animal running through the tunnel and leaving their footprints. Now, this illustration here is the original version as was published in 1977, in the days when scientists were not supposed to try to make a profit out of their work. Oh, for the days. This was public domain, and of course that made it much easier to be taken up, and it's now not in that version, but in the latest version, which was taken up, as it could be, because it wasn't copyrighted, by a company called Gotcha Traps, and they make these much lighter and easier to carry tunnel traps, and these are the standard version. It was the same idea. The same idea was taken up from that work published in 1977. So after knowing where they are and roughly how many there are, the second thing you need to know to understand stoat populations is how they're breeding, their breeding cycle. And the breeding cycle of stoats is really quite extraordinary. It's unlike any other animal you can think of. This is a cross-section of the ovary of a stoat, and I know that that animal was mated because every one of these little bodies here is called a corpus luteum, and every one is a one-for-one replacement for an egg that was released and fertilized. So if you can take serial sections of both ovaries of a female and then count these little bodies as they come into and out of and through the serial sections, you can end up by having a fairly clear estimate of the fertility rate of those animals in all different circumstances. This is Jenny Moody, one of my most helpful and patient technicians. We, between us, sectioned both ovaries of 528 females, which took quite a while. The interesting thing about how stoats proceed from that point is that instead of implanting the fertilized egg into the uterus, as most mammals do, the first stage of the cell, which is just a little ball of cells called a blastocyst, it develops for about 2 weeks and then it starts just floating free in the uterus. But it is maintained by the hormones produced by the corpus, and they remain in that relationship for 9 months, which means that the females which are fertilized in November 1 year don't produce their offspring until August or September of the following year. And that means that all the females that you can sample for the intervening months all have these handy little badges to tell me what their fertility rate was. Then when it comes to the actual production of the young, how many of those blastocysts which actually turn into nestlings depends on how well fed the female is. If she's very well fed, a lot of them will be, or even all of them. And if she's not very well fed, she may lose some or even most of them. And so you can look at the fertility rate in the second year to see how the females adjust their productivity to the food which is available in that season, even though they didn't know what it was when they first mated. And the other, even more extraordinary thing about stoat reproduction, in case you didn't think any of that was extraordinary enough, is the fact that the young females, when they're only about 6 weeks old and still with their eyes shut and barely able to stagger around the nest, are fully reproductively mature. They have a very early puberty, which means that the male who visits the nest to serve their mother will also rumble around through the nest trying to find all the females, and he will fertilize all of them as well. And if this sounds like an animal version of rape, it's not that. The young females, get terribly excited when they smell the male coming into the nest, and they rush round after him and trill after him and incite him to fertilize them. It's in their interest to do that, because every female then that leaves the nest is already fertilized. And anywhere she goes, even to a place where there are no other stoats, like on an offshore island, she's already got the makings of a new population within her. And you may ask, how do the males know the difference? And the answer is that there's this little mane on the neck here. It's about the only hair they have at the time. And underneath it is a gland that gives a scent which is different in males and females. So the male knows what he's picked up, and if it's a male, he just drops it, and if it's a female, he impregnates it. And the third thing we need to know about how stoat populations work is how long the adults live. It's been known for a long time that if you look at the root of one of the canine teeth, and this is a canine tooth upside down, so the pointy bit is at the bottom. At the root, there are often lines in the dental, in the cementum here. And it would be very convenient if those happened to be annual, because they would give you the age of the adults. It's easy to assume that, but you can't do that unless you're quite sure and have made the connection with a set of known aged animals. So we set up an experiment before a period when we thought that young were going to be very abundant, and we captured them in live traps as opposed to fen traps, and we put ear tags on them and released them in the hope of getting some of them back. And in that year, we marked and released 134 tagged stoats of all ages. We got 22 of them back. And the answer was, when we looked at them, and the field data and the histological data, that the correlation between their real age and the lines in the tooth really is true. Those lines do tell you that the age in years of those animals. In that 22, the most number we ever got was 5, but then when we applied the same technique to a much larger group of animals collected from all over all the national parks, we found very rarely there were a few that lived to 6 to 8 years, but most of them didn't live past or even to their second birthday. So most stoats live a fairly short life, and a very few live quite a long life. And this was what we needed to know in order to estimate the input and output of the stoat population. Now, this is important because in the beech forests that cover so much of the South Island, there is a tremendously significant event that happens every so often, what's called a beech mast event, when all or most of the trees all dump a huge amount of seed on the ground at once. And this is a predator evasion technique on their part, because the more seed there is, the less likely it is that all the seed will be eaten. But on the ground at that time, this is heaven for the forest rodents. And so the rats and mice eat a lot of the seeds instead of stopping breeding in the autumn like they usually do. They breed right through the winter, and the stoats, what stoats are there may not be very many, but they're very well fed, and by the time of the springtime, you've got a lot of female stoats in very good condition, producing very large numbers of offspring, just as the time that the rats and mice are beginning to disappear. So when those young come out in the following summer, you've got a huge increase in the numbers of young stoats, which have now then to compete with each other for food, and as the mice are disappearing, and of course that is extremely bad news for the birds. So having put together all that we figured out about how populations work, that meant that we could then understand what was going on during the beech cycle. So what it boils down to is that after a seed fall, we get lots more mice, and lots more mice means lots more stoats, and lots more stoats is bad news for birds, because the stoat diet tends to include roughly the same proportion of birds in any density of mice, because there aren't enough mice to distract them from eating birds. And so that means that if they're all eating about the same number of birds per head, but there are more of them, that means a huge increase in predation on birds. So the question is, can we in fact prevent the damage to the bird populations as a result of this long series of events? And the answer is, you have to remember the basic principle that you can only reduce the number of animals in a population if you are taking them away faster than they can replace themselves. And basically, you have to be able to add to their natural mortality. And because their natural mortality varies so substantially through the year, through the beech masting year, because their fertility and survival also vary naturally, it depends what point in the beech cycle you set traps as to how much difference you're going to make. So if you set traps during the winter, when there aren't very many stoats, but they're very well fed, that means that you can kill a lot of stoats. This is the raw number of stoats killed. And this here is the true removal rate. And because they would have lived and bred on their own, because in that period they're in very good nick, then any that you can kill at that time is a bonus, because you're removing some that could have bred and lived themselves. The problem is, because there aren't very many of them at that time, it doesn't seem to be so urgent. There doesn't seem to be much damage. The damage is much more visible in the following year, in the following summer, when what we've got is lots and lots of stoats, something like about ×5 increase in the numbers of stoats, and they are contributing to a huge amount of damage to the birds. But because by then the mice are already disappearing, they have tremendous competition with each other, their survival rate has gone right down. It's much more difficult in the seed four year to exceed to add to their natural mortality. And so what you've got here is a large number of animals caught, but only a few that otherwise would have bred. So basically you're substituting for natural mortality rather than adding to it. Clearly, trapping through a beach seed fall, which has been standard for a long time because it was the only thing we could do, isn't going to cut it, especially not at very high densities and at very large landscape scales. Something better is needed at landscape scale, which is needed to protect the birds. So a new strategy has been done since 2014 to 15. The DOC now is confident enough of what the consequences are going to be of a beach seed fall. First of all, they just check that they're going to be an increase in rodents over the winter, and they set the now standard version of the footprint tunnels. And then they set in train a very carefully organised, very well supervised 1080 operation over very large areas which are needed to protect these vulnerable birds. And 1080, I assure everybody, I agree, it's an awful thing to have to use, but it's the best we've got right now, and we've got to hang on to the birds we've got until we get something better. It really does work very well, because a lot of rats are killed and a lot of stoats are killed because they eat the rats that have taken the poison. And then DOC will check that they have actually done the job by doing another round of tunnel tracking to compare the percentage of tunnels tracked before and after. And if they've got, after the 1080 drop, almost no tunnels tracked, then that means that the 1080 operation has been successful. And just recently, only about last week, DOC published the results of that 2014-15 operation, in which they were able to look at the improvement in nesting success of 4 species of birds in places where they had dropped 1080 and in places where they didn't. And as I say, because counting the number of dead animals really doesn't tell you very much, because you don't know what proportion of the population you've removed, therefore stoats can't tell you whether it was helpful or not. You have to ask the birds that. And that's what they were doing here. They were monitoring nesting success. And so in these 4 species, the mohua or yellowhead, the rifleman, the rock wren, and the South Island robin, they all benefited from the removal of rats during their breeding season. And they have had much greater breeding success in that year than would have happened if DOC had done nothing. Of course, beech forest isn't the only place where vulnerable birds live. Of course, our national icon, the kiwi, is a matter of great concern. And the young ones, this one is up at Maungatautari, which is a good, safe place for young kiwi, because under 6 months or about 1 kilo in weight, they can't fight off a stoat. They're much too vulnerable to being killed by stoats, if there are any. It doesn't take very many stoats either to make a difference. So Maungatautari is a great place, but it's, even though it's the largest of its kind, it's still far too small to produce a self-sustaining population of kiwi. For that, you have to have a place of about 20,000 hectares, where it's much too big to fence and impractical to trap at the density required, so 1080 is used there too. And these are figures from the Tongariro Forest Kiwi Sanctuary, which show fairly clearly that every time there's a 1080 drop, the survival of the kiwi trick goes up. It doesn't last because, of course, the rats and the stoats come back, but then you do it again and you can repeat the same benefit. So temporary benefits are really important on the mainland, but the only permanent protection, of course, is on an offshore island far enough away from the mainland to be able to achieve an eradication and prevent reinvasion. And over the last 50 years or so, DOC has improved the techniques for doing that, starting, of course, with the largest and easiest targets on the large islands, but over time improving technology and confidence so that nowadays it's routine to get even quite small pests off large islands. And DOC is rightfully very proud of this. And New Zealand has pretty well the only global export industry in techniques and expertise in island eradications. Their work is required all over the world. So it became a pretty nasty shock when two islands which had been eradicated, Kapiti and Rangitoto, at huge expense, were suddenly reinvaded by stoats. And the question that was asked at the time was, could stoats actually have swum across that water gap? It's much further than what was considered to be the furthest that a stoat could swim, which at the time was taken as 1.5 kilometres. Or is it possible that they were taken there by some malicious human action? The question had to be resolved by how far stoats could swim. And to answer that question, I conducted an experiment here. An experiment could only have been done here at Waikato because it required the use of a flume, which is a sort of a waterway with a continual current circulating through it. And you can set it at whatever speed you wish. It's normally, of course, used for fish, but we wanted to use it to see how animals could swim. We started off by borrowing a couple of rats to check our techniques and our procedures. They were rather unimpressed with this. We gave them back to their owners, not happy, but at least much cleaner than when we borrowed them. And then we brought in our stoats. And our stoats, we watched swimming against the current, and one of them could swim for 2 solid hours without stopping, a total of 2 kilometres, that's 1 kilometre an hour, and which was perfectly within the possibilities of stoats being able to get onto those islands, particularly if they had a bit of help from a current or from a floating log. So this work has reviewed the idea of how many islands we have at safe distance from reinvasion of stoats, and it could only have been done here at Waikato thanks to our friends in the Aquatic Research Centre. So going back to the question we started from, is the idea of predator-free New Zealand feasible? And that the answer requires looking into the future. And this is a very difficult thing to do, a very risky thing to do, but there are writers, particularly science fiction writers, who've been doing that all the time. And one of the most famous ones is Arthur C. Clarke. And he wrote this, that basically people who know their stuff, if you ask them whether something is possible, that they might be right about that, but they're not very good at predicting the future into the realm of impossible. And I can appreciate that because I was present at a meeting in Wellington in 1976 where they were debating how large an island you could get rats off. And anybody in New Zealand at the time was there, and they all agreed that about 1 hectare is the largest island that you could clear from stoats. Well, 1 mark to Clark, they were wrong. His second point is that if you want to know what's possible, you have to go past what you think is the boundary of the possible. And here, again, Clark was proved right, because only a few years after that meeting, 2 of my former colleagues from DSIR dared to defy the advice of their boss and go and take Norway rats off Breaksea Island, which is 170 hectares, and they cleared that island of rats in 3 weeks. And since then, the boundaries have been improved even further. Campbell Island, 11,000 hectares. In only this short period of time, 76 to 2001, the size of an island that could be cleared has been increased by orders of magnitude. So it would be a very brave person who would look ahead another 25 years and ask what we could do, or try to decide what could be done, not knowing what techniques might be available in the future. Clark's third law is probably the one that's best known, and if he's right again, and he may well be, it will mean requiring inventing techniques that really are not much different from magic, because the techniques that are needed to achieve predator-free New Zealand in 2050 have to be free of side effects. It must not cause increase of lower-level predators released from control. It must meet social concerns about expenditure and about use of the techniques. I mean, look at the amount of protest there is about 1080 already. And it must get past the fact that nature is on the animal's side. That is, any individuals which are capable of evading whatever you throw at them are automatically the parents of the next generation, and perhaps producing offspring that are just the same. And then, of course, there's the little matter of the enormous costs. So we're looking for something which is as different from what we now know as the electron microscope is from the light microscope. And it's going to be as impossible for us to predict that as it was for the people who were at the 1976 meeting could predict what's happened now. And so basically, here's another quote from somewhere or other, a very thing to keep in mind. If we're going to do this, we've got to do it ourselves. We have to create a potential future predator-free New Zealand. And a comment that was made to me by one of my overseas correspondents was, well, it sounds pretty difficult, but if anybody can do it, the New Zealanders can do it, because of our reputation for a can-do attitude and a real desire to see this outcome. So looking at all of that over all the 45 years that I've been working on these animals here in New Zealand, I have to say that it's the best place in the world to research these animals. When I was working on the second edition of my book, I found that fully a third or more of the global literature about stoats came from New Zealand. We have made an enormous and disproportionate contribution to the general knowledge of these animals. And it's the same with ferrets. That's not an exportable industry, because there's almost nobody in the world who has as many feral ferrets as we have. But feral ferrets are a handy surrogate for another pest, which is very much more serious in the Northern Hemisphere, at least, the American mink. They're about the same size and they're related, and you can find out quite a lot of useful stuff from ferrets that helps and is in fact already helping to inform management of American mink. So for me, it's been an enormous privilege to be able to work on these animals in this country. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that, and for the people who made it possible. Mick Southern was my doctoral supervisor, and he was the most important influence in my life in those years. Then John Gibb was the one who gave me my first job in New Zealand, and I was there with DSIR for those years. And then after a long gap when I was doing other things, Warwick Sylvester in 1991 was the one who made it possible for me to get a foothold here in the university. So I'm enormously grateful to all of those, and also to any number of colleagues, wonderful colleagues here and in other institutions. And I've had some absolutely great students, and colleagues in the category of colleagues I include not just academics, but all the wonderful teams of technicians and libraries and secretaries without whom this place would just simply run aground. And then there have been funding opportunities when I needed them. Very rarely very large, but enough to be able to take advantage of the opportunities I had. And then finally, of course, the unwielding support of my family and friends, and especially my husband, Ken Ayres. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, all of you, for coming and sharing this story with me. Good night.
Thank you, Kim. What a comprehensive and fantastic story that you've told us tonight. Before I reflect on what you've shared with us, I'd like to invite the President of the Royal Society of New Zealand, Emeritus Professor Richard Bedford, to make a presentation to Kim.
Kia ora ana tātou katoa. Vice-Chancellor, thank you for this opportunity to use the occasion of Professor Kim King's address to acknowledge another contribution that she has made. In her presentation tonight, she made passing reference to some years between the time she was here and the time she was working as a scientist in DSIR. Those years stretched to 33 years of service to the Royal Society of New Zealand. Firstly, as an editor of the Society's premier journal, the Journal of the Royal Society, and then as an editor of the journal that deals with zoology. She actually led the team that developed that journal as an independent and separate contribution to the literature. This is an outstanding contribution in terms of editorial work, and the Royal Society wanted me, if I was able to come to Hamilton, to present to Professor King a certificate in recognition of her service. It's not something the Royal Society does very often, but in this case, it's obviously a very meritorious contribution, and we hope she hasn't got too many copies of it. A major book that has been published on the biology and conservation of a venerable survivor, the tuatara, because I'm sure that much of the work that Professor King is doing is also going to contribute to preserving so many of our really important native species. So, Professor King, it gives me great pleasure to present these to you.
I won't keep you long. I understand drinks are outside, and I'm sure many of you have questions of Kim that you can ask out there. But Kim, what a wonderful story that you've told us tonight. In fact, as a biosecurity scientist, it's fascinating to see the terrestrial side of the event. You've shared with us the fact that if you want to achieve biosecurity outcomes, you absolutely have to understand the animal that you wish to eradicate. And even more importantly,
the contribution that science makes, not only to achieving those outcomes, but to the policy decisions and the societal engagement that we have. Predator-free New Zealand will require as many dedicated and comprehensive scientists as you into the future, and I think that we can achieve that outcome. It is a significant one, and hopefully we'll actually dip our feet into the water as well when we're making it predator-free. That was a truly professorial address. Please join me in congratulating Kim on receiving her professorship.